Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay, and as we settle into the ancient world of Sumer, that fertile crescent cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where civilization itself decided to set up shop around 4500 BCE, we find ourselves standing in the shadow of Ziggurat, one of those massive stepped pyramids that the Sumerians built, not as tombs but as literal staircases to heaven, because apparently regular prayer wasn't getting through and they needed better reception, and the air here is thick with the scent of burning cedar and myrrh, the smoke curling upward from bronze censers that have been polished so many times, they gleam like captured sunlight, and if you listen carefully, past the distant bleating of sacrificial goats and the rhythmic chanting of priests in their wool kilts, you can almost hear the whisper of reed styluses pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, preserving stories that will survive 4,000 years, while most of our digital photos probably won't make it through next week's software update. And it's in these texts, these cuneiform inscriptions that look like bird tracks in mud, that we find the most extraordinary claims about visitors from the stars, beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, which translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came, though some scholars insist it just means princely offspring, and that everyone's reading way too much into ancient job titles. But let's be honest, if your job title literally includes the phrase came from heaven, people are going to talk, and according to these texts, the Anunnaki arrived on Earth sometime in the distant past, descending from a planet called Nibiru, which may or may not exist, depending on whether you trust NASA or YouTube, bringing with them knowledge of agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and apparently an inexplicable fondness for making humans build really, really large buildings. And the mainstream historical fact here is that the Sumerians genuinely did possess shockingly advanced knowledge for their time, including a base 60 mathematical system we still use for measuring time and angles, a sophisticated understanding of planetary movements, and detailed astronomical charts that wouldn't be matched in accuracy for thousands of years, which is all documented and non-controversial. But then we get into the fringe territory, where some researchers look at passages describing the Anunnaki's arrival and see not metaphor but metallurgy, not poetry but spacecraft, not divine intervention but extraterrestrial colonization, and you have to admit there's something deliciously suspicious about texts that describe gods arriving in boats that glow and thunder and raise dust storms when they land. Though of course the scholarly debate rages on with traditionalists insisting these are purely religious texts, using the symbolic language of their time to describe theological concepts, while the alternative crowd points out that maybe ancient people weren't idiots and knew the difference between a metaphor and an actual flying object. And honestly, you probably won't survive this journey if you can't hold two contradictory ideas in your head simultaneously. But that's what makes it fun. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because pity subscriptions are sad for everyone involved, and I'm not above admitting I need validation, but I'd prefer it be genuine. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is for you, because I love knowing that someone in Perth might be listening to this at dawn while someone in São Paulo is drifting off at midnight. And now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, as we explore what the Sumerian texts actually say about those first days after the Anunnaki arrived and changed everything. Because according to the Enuma Elish, which is basically Sumer's creation story, and was recited annually at the New Year festival in Babylon, making it ancient even by ancient standards, the story begins not with nothing, but with two primordial beings, Apsu the freshwater, and Tiamat the saltwater, whose mingling created the first gods. And this isn't some quaint mythology class trivia, these were real religious texts that shaped how millions of people understood their place in the cosmos. And within this divine genealogy, the Anunnaki emerge as a specific group of deities, numbering either 50 or 600, depending on which text you're reading, and whether the scribe was counting carefully or just threw up his hands and wrote a lot. And these beings allegedly possessed knowledge of metals and mining, which is interesting because the Sumerian civilization appeared remarkably suddenly, with fully formed technologies including bronze working, irrigation systems, the wheel, and written language, leading some archaeologists to describe it as one of history's great mysteries, while others just shrug and say that's how civilization works sometimes. It shows up fully dressed with no awkward teenage phase, and the texts describe how the Anunnaki needed workers for their mines, particularly gold mines, because apparently even cosmic beings from beyond the stars can't resist the lure of shiny yellow metal, which either tells us something profound about gold's universal value or just confirms that even gods aren't immune to looking at something sparkly and going, ooh, want? And mainstream scholars correctly note that the Sumerians did indeed have extensive mining operations, and gold was central to their economy and religious practices, with temple inventories listing vast quantities of gold objects, though the fringe interpretation asks why advanced beings would need primitive humans to mine anything, unless perhaps they were bound by some non-interference directive and couldn't use their presumably superior technology openly. Or maybe they just enjoyed watching humans sweat. Who knows? Cosmic motivations are tricky, and there's this persistent scholarly argument about whether the Sumerian king list, which is an actual historical document, not a conspiracy theory, should be taken literally, when it describes kings who ruled for thousands of years before the flood, with traditional historians dismissing these as symbolic or mythological numbers, while a smaller group points out that the list becomes suddenly and perfectly realistic in its chronology after a certain point, almost as if whoever was keeping records decided to switch from legendary time to actual measured time, and the exact transition point is debated, but it's somewhere around 2900 BCE, and the exact transition point is debated, but it's somewhere around 2900 BCE, and the descriptions of the Anunnaki themselves are fascinating, if you read them carefully, setting aside preconceptions and just looking at what the texts actually say, and they're described as being taller than humans, more beautiful, possessing a radiance or glow, living for vast periods of time, and having the ability to fly between heaven and earth, which sounds like gods, but the texts also describe them eating, drinking, getting drunk, having petty arguments, making mistakes, expressing fear, and occasionally dying, which sounds a lot less like omnipotent deities and more like a badly managed office where everyone has too much power and not enough supervision, sort of like giving nuclear weapons to a homeowners association. And the word Anunnaki itself breaks down linguistically into An, heaven, Anna, to of, and Ki, earth, quite literally meaning the heaven-to-earth connection, though grammarians love to argue about Sumerian linguistics because it's an isolate language with no known relatives, meaning we had to teach ourselves how to read it basically from scratch using bilingual texts, which is like learning Spanish by finding a Spanish-English dictionary written in Portuguese. And there's something almost painfully human about these texts, describing the moment when the Anunnaki first arrived and assessed Earth, finding it wild and undeveloped, covered in vegetation and animals, but lacking what they considered civilization. And they looked at this primordial planet and apparently thought this has potential, but it needs a Starbucks, or more accurately, it needed organization, agriculture, cities, and a convenient labor force to maintain all of the above. And the mainstream archaeological record absolutely confirms that something remarkable happened in Mesopotamia around the 5th millennium BCE, a rapid transformation from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to complex urban civilizations with specialized labor, monumental architecture, and bureaucratic systems that required writing to manage. And this wasn't a slow evolution, but more like someone flipped a switch, marked civilization, and suddenly you had the Uruk period with its massive temple complexes, intricate pottery, sophisticated trade networks, and administrative tablets recording grain distributions, livestock counts, and beer rations, because apparently, even in humanity's first cities, people needed to know they were getting their fair share of beer, priorities being what they are. And some researchers look at this sudden flowering of civilization and see the Anunnaki's influence, arguing that humans were given or taught the necessary technologies and organizational principles, while mainstream historians attribute it to a particularly favorable climate period, increased population density, and the natural human capacity for innovation. When you put enough people together in one place, and someone invents agriculture, which admittedly tends to kickstart everything else, since it's hard to develop philosophy when you're constantly foraging for dinner, and the texts describe specific Anunnaki individuals with distinct personalities and roles, not vague archetypal gods but beings with names, genealogies, job descriptions, and ongoing personal drama that makes ancient Mesopotamian theology read less like scripture and more like a very detailed soap opera with better costumes and more smiting. And there's Enlil, the lord of the air and storms, temperamental and powerful, who plays a central role in nearly every major myth, and Enki, the lord of water and wisdom, clever and creative, often portrayed as humanity's advocate and teacher, the one who seems to actually like humans, rather than merely tolerating them as convenient tools, and Ninhursag, the mother goddess associated with birth and fertility, and Anu, the sky father, who's important but mostly stays in heaven managing the administrative side of divinity, while others do the field work. It's a whole organizational hierarchy that someone clearly spent a lot of time thinking through, and the fringe interpretation points out that this sounds suspiciously like a colonization mission with clear chains of command, specialized roles, and a home base, Heaven Nibiru, that leadership rarely leaves, while traditionalists emphasize that all ancient pantheons have hierarchies because that's how ancient people understood power, by projecting their earthly political structures onto the divine realm, and both groups are probably right to some degree, because humans are really good at seeing patterns even when they're not there, and really bad at seeing patterns even when they are. It's our dual superpower and weakness, and the sensory experience of being in ancient Sumer as these stories unfold must have been overwhelming. Imagine the heat of Mesopotamia in summer, that dry pressing warmth that makes the air shimmer and turns the mud brick walls into radiant ovens, and the constant sound of water, because civilization here depended absolutely on irrigation, the gurgle of canals, the splash of water being lifted in leather buckets, the distant rush of the great rivers that made all of this possible, and at night the smell of cooking fires, barley and lentils and fish from the rivers, dates and figs and onions, the basic diet that sustained the world's first cities, and everywhere the presence of the ziggurats, those artificial mountains rising from the flat floodplain, their walls painted in bright colors, blues and reds and whites, designed to be seen from miles away as declarations that yes, the gods live here, or at least they visit regularly, and have excellent real estate, and one can imagine the priests ascending those long staircases at dawn, carrying offerings to the godhouse at the summit, knowing or believing they might encounter one of the Anunnaki, and whether those encounters were literal or spiritual or completely imagined, doesn't change the fact that they shaped everything about how this civilization functioned, its laws, its architecture, its agriculture, its art, its entire worldview built on the foundation that powerful beings from above had established order and expected humans to maintain it. And there's something both comforting and terrifying about that kind of certainty, knowing your place in a cosmic hierarchy, understanding that someone or something more powerful has a plan, even if that plan mostly involves you harvesting barley and occasionally building pyramids. And the texts from this period, and we're talking about real archaeological finds here, thousands of tablets recovered from sites like Uruk, Udur, Lagash, and Nippur, describe a world where humans and gods interact regularly, not as equals obviously, but with a directness that's startling, gods appearing in dreams to give instructions, manifesting in temples to accept offerings, walking through cities to inspect work. And yes, this could all be religious metaphor, but it could also be something else, something stranger. And the beauty of ancient history is that we'll never know for certain. We're always interpreting, always guessing, always bringing our own biases to texts that were written in a language dead for 2,000 years, about events that happened 2,000 years before that. And yet here we are, still fascinated, still arguing, still wondering what really happened in those first days, when according to the Sumerians themselves, beings from heaven arrived, and everything changed. The organizational structure the Anunnaki established once they settled on Earth, according to the tablets recovered primarily from the ancient library of Nippur, which was essentially the religious capital of Sumer, and housed thousands of cuneiform texts that scribes copied and recopied for centuries, making Nippur the ancient world's equivalent of a backup server, preserving stories that individual cities might have lost, reveals a hierarchy so detailed and specific that it either represents a genuine historical bureaucracy being recorded or the most elaborate fictional world-building project in human history. And honestly, given how much time the Sumerians spent on administrative tablets documenting everything from temple beer rations to the exact measurements of fields, they were definitely capable of either. These people loved a good list, and at the top of the divine hierarchy sat Anu, whose name simply means sky or heaven, and he remained in the celestial realm most of the time, sort of like a CEO who never comes down to the office but still technically runs everything. And beneath him came the division of earthly responsibilities, with Enlil receiving dominion over the air and earth's surface, the atmosphere and weather, making him the most immediately powerful god from a human perspective because he controlled whether you ate that year or starved. No pressure there. And Enki received the underground waters, the Apsu, which sounds like a consolation prize until you realize that in an irrigation-based civilization, controlling freshwater means controlling literally everything. And there's a scholarly debate about whether Enlil or Enki was considered more important, with different city-states naturally favoring their own patron deity, And this wasn't academic debate, but serious political theology, because if your city's god ranked higher in the divine hierarchy, that theoretically gave your city more legitimacy when competing for resource or territory, religion and politics being thoroughly mixed in a way that would make modern diplomats weep, though honestly not much has changed. And the mainstream historical fact here is that Sumerian city-states absolutely did compete intensely, fighting frequent wars over water rights, grazing lands, and trade routes, with each city's patron deity supposedly leading their human armies into battle, which must have made for interesting post-battle theology when you lost, like did our god have an off day, or did their god cheat? And the texts describe how the Anunnaki divided various responsibilities among themselves, creating what amounts to a cosmic job distribution system, with different deities overseeing grain growth, brickmaking, shepherding, weaving, beer brewing, and every other aspect of Sumerian life, because apparently, even divine beings appreciate specialization, and nobody wants to be responsible for everything. It's exhausting, and this is where it gets interesting from a fringe perspective, because this level of organization, this systematic division of labor, sounds less like mythology and more like an actual management structure being documented, as if someone was literally writing down who was responsible for what in a real operational hierarchy. And you have to admit it's oddly specific, like why would a purely mythological text bother to explain that Ninkasi is specifically the goddess of beer brewing, with detailed hymns describing the brewing process, unless beer brewing was genuinely important enough to require divine oversight, which to be fair, it probably was because beer was safer than water, and constituted a significant portion of the Sumerian diet, so maybe Ninkasi earned her specialization through sheer necessity and human desperation. And the Atrahasis epic, which is one of the most complete texts we have describing the early period of Anunnaki rule, explains that initially the younger gods, the Igigi, were assigned all the hard labor, digging canals, maintaining irrigation systems, mining for minerals, basically all the grunt work that keeps a civilization running, and they did this for thousands of years, according to the text, which seems excessive even by ancient standards, like surely after the first few centuries someone would unionize, and indeed that's exactly what happens. The Igigi eventually rebel, they throw down their tools, in what might be history's first recorded labor strike, they march on Enlil's temple, surround it while he's sleeping, and basically demand better working conditions, or they'll burn everything down, which is definitely one way to negotiate, and Enlil wakes up to find angry gods with torches outside his house, and has what we might call a panic attack, sending for Anu and Enki to help resolve this crisis. And this whole scene is remarkable, because these are supposed to be gods, but they're acting entirely like stressed middle managers, dealing with a workforce rebellion. There's no omnipotent smiting, no divine wrath ending everything instantly. Instead, there's negotiation, problem-solving, appeals to various parties. It's almost disappointingly bureaucratic for a theological text, and the scholarly debate here centers on whether this rebellion story is allegory for actual human labor revolts in early Sumerian history, with the gods representing ruling classes and the Igigi representing workers, or whether it's pure theological drama explaining why certain changes occurred and how the gods organized their activities, though of course the alternative interpretation is that this describes a real event among a group of technologically advanced beings, a labor dispute among extraterrestrials, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that humans rebel against bad working conditions, and if that's a universal trait, then maybe advanced beings would too, unless advancement specifically means eliminating labor disputes, which seems optimistic, and the solution the Anunnaki Council devises is remarkable in its implications, rather than improving conditions for the Igigi or distributing the work more fairly, which would be the obvious solution if we're talking about immortal beings with infinite time. They instead decide to create a new species to take over the labor, a being that can do the physical work but doesn't have the power or longevity to effectively rebel, and this is where we get the creation of humans, and the mainstream historical fact is that Sumerian texts do indeed describe humans being created specifically to serve the gods, to take over their agricultural and construction labors, and this is stated explicitly in multiple texts including the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis. It's not a fringe interpretation, it's literally what the texts say. The controversial part is whether we take this as theological metaphor for humans' religious duty to the gods, or as a more literal description of something that actually happened, and the creation process itself is described in fascinatingly specific detail, with Enki the clever one directing the operation because of course the crisis gets resolved by the smart god doing something creative. And according to the Atrahasis, They take clay from the earth, the pure clay from the Apsu, and they mix it with the blood of a slain god, specifically a god named Wilu, who was one of the rebel leaders, and was sacrificed as both punishment and raw material, which is dark even by ancient mythology standards, like they literally killed a god and used his blood as an ingredient. And this mixture of earth and divine blood is then shaped by the mother goddess Ninhursag, who forms humans on her womb essentially, and breathes life into them. And this creates beings who are part earth and part divine, mortal but containing a spark of the gods themselves. And there's your explanation for why humans are self-aware and capable of complex thought. According to this theology, we literally have divine DNA, or the ancient equivalent, and the fringe interpretation obviously runs wild with this, seeing genetic engineering, the mixing of extraterrestrial genes with earthly primates, the creation of a hybrid species through biotechnology. And while mainstream scholars roll their eyes so hard they risk injury, it's worth noting that the description doesn't read like other creation myths. There's no speaking things into existence, no emergence from cosmic eggs, no spontaneous generation from parts of a slain giant. Instead, there's a recipe, a process, specific ingredients mixed in specific ways by beings who know what they're doing because they've done this before. And the text even mentions that they create several prototypes, early versions that don't work properly, that can't reproduce or can't survive or lack some necessary quality, before finally perfecting the design, which sounds suspiciously like a trial and error development process, though it could equally be mythological explanation for why humans are imperfect. We're literally version 7.0 or whatever iteration finally worked, and once humans are created, they're immediately put to work, taking over the agricultural and construction labor that the Ajigi had abandoned. And according to the texts, humans were remarkably good at this, multiplying rapidly and spreading across the land, cultivating fields, building cities, maintaining the irrigation systems that kept Mesopotamia fertile. And the archaeological record confirms that around 4000 BCE there was indeed a population explosion in Mesopotamia, accompanied by rapid agricultural development and the establishment of the first true cities. And whether this was because humans were literally just created, or because humans naturally expanded when agricultural techniques improved, is one of those questions where the evidence could support either interpretation, depending on your prior assumptions. And the relationship between humans and the Anunnaki, as described in these early texts, is complicated, not simple master-slave or worshipper deity, but something more nuanced. Humans are servants, but valued servants, created for a purpose, but also protected and guided. And certain gods, particularly Enki, are portrayed as actively caring about human welfare, teaching them arts and sciences, warning them of disasters, advocating for their survival when other gods want to wipe them out. And this creates a mythology where humans aren't just toys or slaves, but something like children or employees, beings with value, even if they're not equals. And the jokes practically write themselves, like imagine being created specifically to do someone else's chores. Your entire species is basically the divine equivalent of a Roomba, but at least you're a Roomba that can write poetry and occasionally sass back, which is more than most automated vacuum cleaners can claim. And the organizational hierarchy established during this period becomes the template for Sumerian society itself, with the temple at the center of each city-state functioning as a mini-version of the divine hierarchy, priests and priestesses representing different gods, managing vast estates, organizing labor, distributing resources, essentially running these early cities as theocratic states where everything from crop rotation to military campaigns was understood as fulfilling divine will. And this system was incredibly effective. Mesopotamian city-states maintained complex civilizations for thousands of years using this model, which suggests that whatever its origins, the organizational structure worked pragmatically, even if its theological justification was debatable. And there are these wonderful administrative tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE that record in painstaking detail the daily operations of temples, how much barley came in from which fields, how much went to feed priests versus temple workers versus the poor, how many sheep were sacrificed on which days, the exact materials used in making textiles. And reading these tablets gives you this vertigo-inducing sense that you're looking at actual history, real people solving real logistical problems. And yet, according to their own inscriptions, they understood all of this as serving the Anunnaki, fulfilling divine commands, maintaining order established by beings from heaven. And the question of whether those beings were literal or symbolic becomes almost beside the point, because the system functioned either way. And there's something profound about that, about how the truth or falsehood of the founding mythology might matter less than whether the system it generates allows people to survive and occasionally thrive, though that's probably a dangerous thought if you think about it too long. Like, does it matter if your entire civilization is based on a misunderstanding, as long as the irrigation canals flow and the granaries are full? And the scholarly consensus is very clear that these texts describe mythological events using the symbolic language of their time to express theological and philosophical concepts about human nature, divine will, and social organization, which is almost certainly correct. But that same scholarly consensus would also have told you 20 years ago that the city of Troy was purely mythological until someone decided to take Homer seriously and actually dug it up. So perhaps absolute certainty about what's myth and what's history should come with an asterisk, especially when you're dealing with texts from a civilization that had writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law codes, and architectural achievements that wouldn't be surpassed for thousands of years. These weren't primitive people recording primitive superstitions. These were sophisticated people with sophisticated culture, recording something they believed to be true. And whether that truth was literal, metaphorical, or some combination depends partly on evidence and partly on our willingness to imagine that the past might be stranger than we've been taught. And the sensory experience of living in this period as a newly created human must have been overwhelming. Imagine having consciousness suddenly, being aware, being self-aware, knowing you exist, and being able to contemplate your existence, and looking around to see these massive beings, the Anunnaki, taller and brighter and more powerful than you, telling you what to do, teaching you how to plant grain and channel water and build structures from mud brick, and the whole world is new because you're new. Every sunset is the first sunset. Every taste is a revelation. The cool water from the canal, the coarse bread made from barley, the shade of a date palm in the pressing heat. And maybe this is what the texts mean by humans being awakened or given knowledge, not information, but consciousness itself, the capacity to know that you know. And whether this happened through divine intervention or through natural evolution, the result is the same: beings capable of wonder and work, of building civilizations and writing poems about gods. And the Anunnaki must have looked at these early humans and felt something, pride perhaps, or satisfaction, the way you might feel watching a project succeed, or maybe something more complex, guilt even, because according to several texts there were gods who objected to creating humans, who foresaw the problems this would cause, the noise and chaos and eventual rebellion, because of course humans weren't content to just serve quietly forever. That's not how consciousness works. Give something self-awareness, and eventually it starts asking questions like, why, and what's in it for me, and the ever-dangerous, who says, and the seeds of future conflict are present from the very beginning, built into the design. Humans who are divine enough to be creative and ambitious, but mortal enough to be controllable. A compromise solution that satisfies nobody perfectly, but works well enough to implement, which is basically how all major decisions get made, whether in divine councils or corporate boardrooms. And the fact that we're still talking about these texts 4,000 years later, still debating their meaning, still wondering what really happened in ancient Sumer when civilization suddenly appeared fully formed with its gods and laws and cities, suggests that whatever the truth is, it's sufficiently interesting to survive longer than most of what we consider important today, these clay tablets outlasting empires and religions and languages, carrying forward a story about beings from heaven who came to earth and changed everything, who organized the world and created humans to maintain that organization. And whether you read that as theology, history, allegory, or alien contact report, the end result is the same: a civilization that believed it knew where it came from and why it existed, which is more than most of us can say today, as we drift off contemplating gods and rebels and the first humans blinking in Mesopotamian sunlight, wondering what comes next. The arrangement between the Anunnaki and humanity, this system where gods provided organization and protection while humans provided labor and worship, maintained itself for what the texts describe as generations or ages. And here we enter the murkiest part of Sumerian chronology, where the numbers stop making sense by conventional standards, with kings supposedly reigning for centuries or millennia, and mainstream scholars explain this as either symbolic, mythological, or the result of different calendar systems being confused in transmission, while the fringe interpretation takes these long lifespans literally and suggests either that the Anunnaki genuinely lived for thousands of years because advanced beings from space might have solved aging, or that early humans had much longer lifespans before some catastrophe or genetic change shortened them, or that time itself was measured differently and we're misunderstanding the units. And honestly, All of these explanations have problems, which is what makes ancient chronology such a delightful mess. But what's clear from multiple sources, including the Sumerian king list and the Atrahasis epic, is that eventually tensions arose. Humanity multiplied beyond expectations, spreading across Mesopotamia and becoming numerous and noisy, and there's this recurring theme in the texts that the gods find humans too loud, which is maybe the most relatable divine complaint ever recorded. Like even cosmic beings can't handle the noise level when you get too many humans in one place. We're just inherently loud creatures, always talking, always building, always making a racket. And according to the Atrahasis, this noise becomes so disturbing that Enlil, who remember controls storms and weather, and is generally temperamental at the best of times, decides that humans need to be reduced in number, not completely destroyed at first, but culled, managed, brought back to acceptable levels, and so he sends plagues, then droughts, then famines, each disaster intended to thin the human population. But here's where it gets interesting, because humans keep surviving, they keep bouncing back, and the text explicitly credits Enki for this, the clever water god who apparently likes humans, or at least finds them more interesting than Enlil does, and Enki keeps teaching humans how to survive each catastrophe, giving them knowledge of medicine to survive the plagues, irrigation techniques to survive the droughts, food preservation to survive the famines, and this back and forth between Enlil trying to reduce humanity and Enki helping them survive becomes a recurring pattern, a divine disagreement playing out through human suffering, and the scholarly debate here is whether this represents actual historical disasters being interpreted through theological framework, with plagues and droughts and famines being remembered as divine punishment, or whether it's pure mythology explaining why bad things happen. To humans, the classic theodicy problem of why gods allow suffering, and the answer in Sumerian theology, is refreshingly blunt. Some gods just don't like you that much. It's not mysterious divine plan, it's cosmic personality conflict, and you have to appreciate the honesty, even if it's not comforting. And after several rounds of this disaster cycle, Enlil finally loses patience completely and decides on a final solution, a flood that will wipe out humanity entirely. And here we enter the story that influenced Noah's Ark and every other flood myth in the ancient Near East, because the Sumerian version predates them all. The Atrahasis and the earlier Urdu Genesis both describe a great flood sent by the gods, specifically by Enlil, to destroy humanity for being too numerous and too noisy, which seems like overkill, literally, but apparently divine patience has limits, and Enlil reached his, and he gets the other gods to agree to this plan, swearing them to secrecy, making them promise not to warn humans about what's coming, and they agree. All except Enki, who technically doesn't break his oath, but finds a loophole by talking to a wall. He goes to the wall of a house where a man named Atrahasis, or Ziusudra, depending on which version you're reading, is sleeping, and Enki speaks to the wall saying, "Wall, listen to me. I'm going to describe this totally hypothetical scenario that definitely isn't a warning," and he proceeds to tell the wall exactly how to build a boat, what dimensions, what materials, how to seal it with bitumen, how much food and water to bring, which animals to load, basically complete instructions for surviving a flood. And Atrahasis, who is not at all asleep, but totally coincidentally overhearing this conversation with a wall, takes these hypothetical instructions and builds an actual boat. And you have to love Enki's commitment to malicious compliance. Like, yes, technically he kept his oath not to warn humans directly, he only warned a wall. It's not his fault if a human happened to be listening. And this is the kind of clever rule following that either makes Enki humanity's greatest advocate or the universe's most annoying coworker, depending on your perspective. And the mainstream historical fact here is that flood myths are nearly universal across ancient Near Eastern cultures. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Hebrews all preserved versions of this story, with remarkable consistency in certain details: the righteous man, the divine warning, the boat, the animals, the dove or raven sent out to find land, the rainbow or divine promise afterward. And while most scholars attribute this to either a collective memory of the flooding of the Persian Gulf around 5000 BCE when rising sea levels inundated coastal settlements, or to the regular devastating floods that occurred along the Tigris and Euphrates, which would absolutely seem world-ending to ancient city dwellers, or simply to the human tendency to tell similar stories about disasters, the alternative interpretation suggests that maybe the consistency across cultures indicates a real global event, or at least a regional catastrophe so severe that every culture in Mesopotamia remembered it. And whether the flood was sent by disappointed gods or caused by natural climate events doesn't change. the archaeological evidence that suggests a major discontinuity in Mesopotamian settlement patterns around 2900 BCE, with many sites showing a sterile layer of water-laid sediment between earlier and later occupations, and this could be the flood layer, though dating it precisely enough to match the mythological timeline is nearly impossible with current techniques. So we're left in this frustrating space where something probably happened, but we can't be sure exactly what or when or how severe it really was. And the texts describe how the flood, when it comes, is terrifying. Rain that's never stopped before because weather itself hasn't been this extreme. The rivers overflowing, the canals backing up, water rising from below and falling from above, and Atrahasis seals himself and his family, and the animals in the boat, and waits, and even the gods are terrified according to the text. They retreat to the highest heaven and cower like dogs, which is a remarkably undignified image for deities, and suggests that either the flood was genuinely more extreme than expected, or that Sumerian theology wasn't afraid to show its gods being frightened, powerless. And there's something almost endearing about that, like these are beings powerful enough to destroy the world but still capable of fear and regret. Enlil's rage giving way to satisfaction as the waters rise and humans are drowned. But then after the flood, when the waters recede, and Atrahasis emerges and makes a sacrifice and the gods smell the sweet savor and gather around the offering like refugees at a food line, there's this remarkable moment where the gods realize they've made a terrible mistake, because who's going to feed them now? Who's going to maintain the temples? Who's going to do all the work they created humans to do in the first place? They've just destroyed their entire workforce in a fit of temper. And suddenly Enlil's bright idea seems less clever and more like spectacular self-sabotage. And there's furious argument among the gods, recriminations, blame-shifting. Enlil angry that a human survived because it ruins the completeness of his destruction. Enki admitting he warned Atrahasis because completely destroying humanity was stupid. Other gods taking sides. And eventually they reach a compromise. Humans can survive and repopulate, but they'll have shorter lifespans, higher infant mortality, periods of infertility, basically multiple checks on population growth, so they never become numerous enough to be a problem again. And whether you read this as theology explaining why humans age and die, something more literal, a genetic modification introduced after the flood to reduce human lifespans from whatever they were before to the 70 or 80 years we consider normal now. It's a dark solution. Death itself as population control, and the texts are quite explicit that humans weren't originally meant to die so quickly, that death at hundreds of years old was the intended design, and the shortening of lifespan was a punishment or correction implemented after the flood. And mainstream scholars obviously interpret this as mythology explaining mortality's origin, rather than describing an actual change in human biology. But it's worth noting that the shift in the king list from mythological thousand-year reigns to more realistic century or less reigns happens right after the flood narrative, almost as if whoever compiled the list believed that's when time itself changed, or when the measurement of time became standardized, or when something fundamental shifted in how humans experience duration. And the fringe interpretation naturally sees genetic tampering, the Anunnaki reducing human lifespans deliberately to keep the species controllable, because a human who lives for centuries would accumulate too much knowledge and power and become a threat. Better to keep them short-lived and dependent. And while that sounds paranoid, it's also exactly what the text says happened. We just can't agree on whether it happened literally or metaphorically, and the sensory experience of the flood as described is genuinely terrifying. Imagine being Atrahasis, sealed in the boat in absolute darkness because there are no windows, just air holes near the roof, and feeling the boat lifted and tossed by waters you cannot see, the roar of rain on the roof, the creaking of the wooden hull, the sounds of animals panicking in the dark, and the smell, oh God, the smell, because you're trapped with your family and every species of livestock in a sealed box for weeks. And that's not mentioned in the mythology, but it's definitely implied. And then the silence when the rain finally stops. More terrifying than the noise because you don't know if it's over or just a pause, and sending out birds through the air holes to see if they return with signs of dry land, and the wait, the endless waiting while the waters recede, and finally the grinding of the boat against something solid, the mountain peak where it comes to rest, which according to different texts is either Nisir or Ararat, or somewhere else depending on who's telling the story, and which mountain range was most impressive to them, and opening the door finally to see a world washed clean, empty, silent. Everyone you knew is dead. Every city is gone. You and your family are literally the only humans left. And whether that's historical memory, mythological drama, or emotional truth about what survival feels like, it's powerful stuff. and the post-flood world is described as a new beginning. Humanity gets a second chance, but under modified conditions. And the Anunnaki remain, but their relationship to humans has changed. There's less direct contact, more distance, gods retreating from daily involvement in human affairs. And whether this represents the historical shift from theocratic temple states to more secular kingship, or the natural evolution of religion from immediate divine presence to distant divine authority, or an actual change in extraterrestrial policy toward humans, the effect is the same. Humanity becomes more independent, less directly supervised, required to figure more things out themselves, and this is when civilization really takes off. According to the archaeological record, the post-flood period in Mesopotamian chronology sees the rise of the great city-states, Uruk and Ur and Lagash, the development of writing from simple accounting marks to full literature, the construction of the first true ziggurats, the establishment of trade networks, reaching from Afghanistan to Egypt, and it's as if humanity matured, stopped being children, requiring constant divine instruction, and became adolescents, capable of some independent function, even if they still occasionally needed intervention. And the texts from this period show a shift in tone, less about gods doing things, and more about humans acting while asking divine approval, less theophany and more theology. And whether this represents historical development or mythological maturation doesn't much matter, because the result is the civilization we recognize as Sumerian, fully human, but shaped by memory of divine instruction, still worshipping the Anunnaki, but no longer expecting them to appear physically in every crisis. And the question of whether those divine visitors were ever literal becomes almost beside the point, because their influence was permanent, embedded in the structure of Mesopotamian civilization, in its writing system that preserved their names, in its mathematical system based on their alleged teachings, in its astronomical observations tracking the heavens from which they supposedly came, and 4,000 years later, we're still finding their traces in the foundations of our own civilization. Because so much of what we consider basic, writing, and cities and law codes, and mathematics, all emerged first in Sumer, under the shadow of the ziggurats built for gods from the stars. And whether those gods were metaphor or memory, their legacy survived the flood, and everything else history threw at it, which is more than most gods can claim. And as we drift past this pivot point in the mythology, this moment when humanity nearly ended but didn't, when the Anunnaki almost abandoned their project but decided to continue it under revised conditions, we can feel how this story shaped everything that came after, how the memory of catastrophe and survival, of divine anger and divine mercy, of cosmic conflict between gods who destroy and gods who preserve, became central to how Mesopotamian people understood their place in the universe. Servants who survived, workers who endured, creatures divine enough to matter, but mortal enough to fear, walking the earth, the Anunnaki had organized, living in the cities they had taught humans to build, looking at the stars from which they had come, and wondering if they were still watching, still judging, still deciding whether this modified humanity was working better than the first attempt. And the answer must have seemed uncertain because humans kept being loud and numerous and difficult to manage, which is apparently just what we do. The centuries following the flood saw humanity spread and multiply once again, rebuilding what had been lost. And according to Sumerian records, this is when civilization truly flourished, when the great cities rose, not just as scattered settlements, but as actual urban centers with populations in the thousands, with Uruk reaching perhaps 50,000 inhabitants at its peak in the 4th millennium BCE, making it likely the largest city in the world at that time, a concentration of humanity that would have been unimaginable in the pre-flood world. And the mainstream historical fact here is that Uruk absolutely was revolutionary in its scale and organization, with massive defensive walls that later tradition attributed to the hero king Gilgamesh, with the White Temple and the Anna district containing multiple sacred complexes, with sophisticated pottery, cylinder seals showing mythological scenes, and the earliest examples of writing we've yet discovered, simple pictograph, pressed into clay that would evolve into the cuneiform system. And this wasn't gradual development, it was explosive, civilization going from simple farming villages to complex urban states in a few centuries. And while mainstream archaeology explains this through environmental and social factors, increased agricultural productivity from irrigation, allowing surplus food production, which allowed specialization of labor, which allowed all the complexity that defines civilization. The alternative interpretation looks at the same evidence and sees the influence of the Anunnaki, direct instruction in technologies and organizational principles, knowledge transfer from advanced beings to humans ready to receive it, and the texts themselves support this reading because they explicitly describe gods teaching humans specific skills, Enki teaching agriculture and mathematics and medicine, Inanna teaching the arts of civilization which she stole from Enki in one of mythology's great heist, stories where she gets him drunk and he gives her the mez, which are essentially the fundamental decrees or principles that make civilization possible, everything from kingship to writing to sexual practices, over 100 of them according to lists that survive, and the fact that the Sumerians conceptualized civilization as consisting of discrete transferable knowledge packages that could be stolen or gifted, is itself interesting. Like they understood that what separated civilized from uncivilized wasn't inherent superiority but possession of specific knowledge, and this is surprisingly sophisticated cultural anthropology for people who supposedly didn't have our modern insights, and the relationship between gods and humans during this period is portrayed in texts as something like partnership, humans building and maintaining the temples, providing offerings and worship, while gods provided protection, prosperity, and continued instruction in various arts, and each major city had a patron deity who was understood to literally dwell in that city's main temple, with the ziggurat serving as their house, their earthly residence, and the wealth of these temples was staggering. Temple inventories from the 3rd millennium BCE listing tons of grain, thousands of livestock, workshops producing textiles and pottery and metalwork, and all of this was understood as belonging to the god, but being managed by priests on the god's behalf, essentially making temples the first corporations, large-scale economic entities with complex internal organization and external trade relationships. And whether gods actually lived there, or temples were just extremely effective at using religious authority to accumulate wealth, the practical result was the same: institutions powerful enough to organize large-scale economic activity, which is what civilization runs on, whether you call it sacred or secular, and the texts describe how different Anunnaki took interest in different aspects of human development, with Nadaba being associated with grain and writing, which makes sense because you need writing to keep track of grain storage and distribution, and Shara being associated with law and justice, and Ningirsu being a warrior god protecting city-states in their endless conflicts with neighbors. And this specialization among the gods mirrors the increasing specialization in human society, where not everyone farms anymore. You have craftspeople, and merchants, and soldiers, and priests and scribes, each group with specific skills and social roles, and the scholarly debate asks whether humans projected their social structure onto the divine realm, or whether they organized their society to reflect divine hierarchy. And the answer is probably both simultaneously, the model flowing both directions, but the fringe interpretation adds a third option, that humans organized their society according to instructions from the Anunnaki, because that's how the Anunnaki themselves were organized, making human civilization a deliberate copy of extraterrestrial social structure. And while that sounds wild, it would explain the sudden sophistication of Sumerian social organization. Like these people went from tribes to complex bureaucratic states in remarkably little time, with legal codes and property rights and contract law and specialized courts, all the institutional infrastructure that took other civilizations much longer to develop, and the Code of Ur-Nammu from around 2100 BCE, which predates Hammurabi's more famous code by 3 centuries, shows sophisticated legal thinking with different penalties for different crimes, protection for the vulnerable, standardized procedures for resolving disputes. It's not primitive tribal justice but actual jurisprudence, and the text itself credits the laws to divine instruction, Ur-Nammu receiving the laws from the god Nana, which is either religious legitimization of human law or an actual claim about the law's origin, depending on your interpretation. And the same pattern appears with writing. The Sumerians credited Enki with its invention, and mathematics they attributed to various gods, and astronomy, which they studied intensely, was understood as learning the patterns of the heavens where the gods dwelled. And there's this consistent theme of knowledge coming from above, being gifted or taught rather than discovered, which could be theology explaining human achievement by attributing it to gods, or it could be cultural memory of actual knowledge transfer, and we'll never know for certain, but the texts are at least consistent in their claim. And one of the most intriguing aspects of this period is the knowledge the Sumerians possessed that seems anachronistic, like they knew about all the planets visible to the naked eye. Plus, they had traditions about additional celestial bodies, and their mathematical system based on 60 is bizarrely sophisticated, far more complex than necessary for basic accounting. Using it, you can easily calculate fractions and astronomical periods. It's a system that seems designed for advanced calculation, not simple record-keeping. And they had knowledge of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes about 26 000 years to complete a cycle, which is remarkable because detecting precession requires precise astronomical observations over many generations. You have to compare current stellar positions to records from centuries or millennia ago, and while the mainstream view is that Babylonian astronomers around 100 BCE first detected precession, there's intriguing evidence in earlier Sumerian texts of awareness of celestial changes that shouldn't have been noticeable without very long-term record-keeping or outside information, and the fringe interpretation obviously suggests the Anunnaki provided this knowledge, telling humans about celestial mechanics they couldn't possibly have observed themselves. While skeptics note that coincidence and pattern-seeking can make ambiguous ancient texts seem to say anything you want them to, and both groups are probably partly right, because ancient texts are genuinely ambiguous, and also humans are really good at finding patterns even in noise. But it's worth acknowledging that Sumerian astronomy was genuinely impressive by any standard. They tracked Venus's movements with precision, predicted eclipses, identified zodiacal constellations, and understood that planets were different from stars. All this without telescopes or modern mathematics, just patient observation and good record-keeping across generations, and whether that came from human brilliance or divine instruction, it's an achievement worth respecting, and the art from this period shows the Anunnaki consistently portrayed as larger than humans, standing or sitting while humans approach them in supplication, often with distinctive headgear, sometimes with wings, though wings might be symbolic rather than literal, and they're shown receiving offerings, participating in battles, presiding over cosmic events, and always they're distinct from humans, visibly different, more perfect in proportion, more elaborate in dress, occupying the top register of images, while humans and human concerns fill the lower registers. And this could be artistic convention representing spiritual superiority through visual hierarchy, or it could be attempting to depict actual physical differences, larger beings who dressed differently, and occupied positions of authority, and the jokes write themselves here. Like imagine being a Sumerian artist, trying to capture the appearance of your gods, and possibly alien overlords, using only a reed stylus and soft clay, the ancient equivalent of trying to draw aliens with crayons. You're doing your best, but you're working with limited tools, and trying to represent something fundamentally difficult to capture, and the fact that these images remain consistent across centuries suggests either very strong artistic tradition or people depicting what they actually saw or believed they saw with remarkable consistency, and the personal seal cylinders that every Sumerian of means owned, little carved stone cylinders that you rolled across clay to leave your identifying mark. These often show mythological scenes of humans interacting with gods, presenting offerings, receiving blessings, fighting demons under divine protection, and these weren't temple art, but personal possessions, meaning regular people were carrying around images of themselves interacting with the Anunnaki, which suggests how central these beings were to everyday Sumerian identity, not distant abstractions, but immediate presences who might involve themselves in your life at any moment. And the sensory experience of living in a Sumerian city during this golden age must have been overwhelming. The scale of the architecture alone, those massive ziggurats rising toward the sky, their walls painted in bright colors, or decorated with cone mosaics, geometric patterns made from thousands of baked clay cones pressed into the walls. The labor involved in creating these structures was immense, millions of mud bricks, each one shaped by hand and dried in the sun, countless hours of work by countless humans, and all of it dedicated to housing gods, creating a suitable earthly dwelling for beings from heaven, and inside the temples the wealth on display, gold and lapis lazuli and carnelian, fine textiles, elaborate furniture, statues of gods with eyes of shell and lapis that seem to watch you, and the smell of incense constantly burning, cedar and myrrh, and other aromatics imported from distant lands, and the sounds of temple life, the chanting of priests in Sumerian and later Akkadian, the lowing of cattle being led to sacrifice, the hammer of craftspeople in temple workshops, scribes scratching styluses into clay, recording everything from hymns to beer rations, and outside the temple complex, the city itself, narrow streets winding between mud brick houses, markets where goods from across the known world were traded, lapis from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, evidence of trade networks spanning thousands of miles, and all of this organized by people who had learned organization from the Anunnaki, according to their own accounts. Whether that's literal or metaphorical, it produced results. These cities functioned, they fed thousands, they defended themselves, they produced art and literature and law, they survived for thousands of years, and the literature from this period is where things get really interesting, because writing evolves from accounting to art, from lists to stories, and suddenly we have actual Sumerian voices preserved, poems and epics and laments, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is humanity's first great work of literature, and it describes a world where gods and humans interact directly, where Gilgamesh is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, which suggests interesting biological arrangements, where his friend Enkidu is created by gods from clay like Adam, where they fight demons, visit divine gardens, anger gods with their hubris, and ultimately Gilgamesh confronts mortality and realizes that humans cannot achieve immortality no matter how much divine blood they carry. And this seems like a meditation on that post-flood change, the reduction of human lifespan, the acceptance that death defines the human condition now. And whether the story is history or philosophy or something between, it's dealing with real questions about what it means to be human in a world organized by gods. And as this classical period of Sumerian civilization reaches its peak around 2500 BCE with the city-states of the early dynastic period, with kings who claim divine descent or divine approval, with art and architecture reaching heights that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries, there's this sense that the system the Anunnaki established is working. Humanity has taken the knowledge and organization they provided and run with it, building something magnificent on the foundation of divine instruction. And whether those divine instructors were literal beings from space or metaphorical projections of human genius onto cosmic figures, the civilization they inspired was undeniably real, undeniably impressive, and undeniably influential because everything that came after, all the civilizations of the ancient Near East, drew on Sumerian innovations, Sumerian knowledge, Sumerian organizational principles, making Sumer the foundation of Western civilization in ways we still haven't fully traced. And as we drift toward the end of this section, toward the period when Sumerian culture begins to be absorbed by Akkadian and later Babylonian empires, when the Anunnaki themselves begin to fade from direct presence to distant memory to pure mythology, we can see how the story we've been following, this narrative of beings from heaven who came to earth and changed everything, who created humans and instructed them, and occasionally regretted creating them, but continued anyway, has shaped not just ancient history, but how we think about human origins, about where knowledge comes from, about whether we're alone in the universe or part of something larger. And the Sumerian answer to these questions, preserved in thousands of clay tablets scattered across museums worldwide, remains provocative and strange and impossible to dismiss entirely because it's written there in humanity's first written words. Beings from heaven came to earth. They changed things. They're still remembered, and whether that remembrance is of gods or aliens, or just the human need to believe we're not entirely responsible for figuring everything out ourselves, it's a story that survives, that fascinates, that refuses to be filed away as simple mythology because it's too specific, too consistent, too embedded in actual historical civilization to dismiss as pure fantasy. And that tension between explanation and mystery is where we'll rest for now, before the final section where we consider what all of this might mean. So here we are at the end of our journey through the oldest stories humans ever wrote down. These tales of the Anunnaki pressed into clay by scribes who lived and died 4,000 years ago in cities that are now dust beneath the desert. And what do we make of it all? This strange collection of creation myths and labor disputes and cosmic floods and divine instruction, these texts that describe with such specificity the arrival of beings from heaven and the changes they brought to earth. And the first thing worth acknowledging is that we genuinely don't know the truth, despite what either the mainstream scholars or the alternative researchers will tell you with absolute certainty. Nobody alive today truly knows whether the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, metaphors, or cultural heroes elevated to divine status. We're all interpreting evidence that's incomplete and ambiguous, reading texts in languages that went extinct 2,000 years ago, describing events that allegedly happened 2,000 years before that. And the margin for error is enormous, which should make us humble but instead seems to make everyone more confident, because humans hate uncertainty and will construct elaborate explanations rather than simply admit we don't know. And both sides do this, traditionalists explaining away anything strange as symbolic or mythological, alternative researchers explaining everything strange as literally extraterrestrial, and the truth assuming there is singular truth rather than many partial truths layered over each other, probably lives somewhere between these extremes, in that uncomfortable space where ancient people were neither primitive superstitious fools nor perfectly accurate historians, where texts can be both theological and historical, where gods can be metaphorical and also based on something real, whatever real means in this context. And the Sumerian texts themselves seem comfortable with ambiguity, They describe gods with consistent names and personalities and genealogies. They place them in specific geographic locations. They give them ordinary activities like eating and sleeping and getting drunk, but they also describe them doing impossible things, living for thousands of years, flying through the sky, creating life from clay, controlling the weather, and medieval people would have had no trouble accepting all of this as literal truth, because they believed in a world where the impossible happened regularly, where miracles were real, and the boundary between natural and supernatural was porous. But we moderns, with our scientific worldview, struggle because we want everything to fit into categories. Either it's natural and therefore possible, or it's supernatural and therefore symbolic. We can't handle the idea that maybe there are other categories, other possibilities that don't fit our predetermined boxes. And this is where the Anunnaki texts become almost a Rorschach test. What you see in them says as much about your assumptions as about what's actually there. If you believe in ancient astronauts, you'll find evidence for ancient astronauts. If you believe in pure mythology, you'll find evidence for pure mythology, and both groups will point to the same passages as proof. And maybe the real lesson is that these texts are rich enough to support multiple interpretations, which is the mark of great literature. It contains more meaning than any single reading can exhaust, and the historical impact of these stories is undeniable regardless of their literal truth. The idea that knowledge came from the gods, that civilization was taught rather than developed, that humans exist to serve higher purposes. These concepts shaped Mesopotamian culture, and through it all, the cultures that borrowed from Mesopotamia, which is basically everyone in the ancient world, the Egyptians, the Hebrews, the Greeks, they all drew on Mesopotamian myths and modified them, and you can trace conceptual lines from the Anunnaki to the Nephilim, to the Titans, to the angels, all these categories of beings who are more than human but less than fully divine, intermediate entities who interact with both gods and people. And this seems to be a fundamental human need, to populate the space between ourselves and ultimate cosmic authority with intermediate beings who are more relatable, more comprehensible, more like us, while still being greater. And whether the Anunnaki were real or imagined, they fulfilled this psychological and theological function perfectly. They were powerful enough to create and instruct, but flawed enough to make mistakes and argue among themselves. They were cosmic enough to come from heaven, but human enough to get drunk and play favorites and regret their decisions. And this makes them better characters than either pure omnipotent deities or mere humans. They occupy this sweet spot of relatability plus power, which is probably why the stories endure. And when you read these texts with fresh eyes, setting aside both the scholarly skepticism and the alternative enthusiasm, what's striking is how matter-of-fact they are. The Sumerians weren't writing breathless accounts of unbelievable wonders. They were recording what they understood to be their history, their origins, their relationship with the powers that organized their world, and they wrote it in the same tone they used for recording grain distributions and legal contracts, which is either evidence that they believed it literally, or evidence that all their writing was equally formal regardless of content. And scholars debate this, whether the Sumerians themselves understood their mythology as literal or as sophisticated theological allegory, and we'll never know because we can't ask them. And the texts themselves don't explicitly say, by the way, this is metaphorical. They just present the stories and let them stand. And 4 millennia later, we're still arguing about what they meant, which would probably amuse the original authors if they could see the elaborate debates their simple records have spawned. All these books and documentaries and academic papers and YouTube videos arguing over what they wrote. And maybe the joke's on all of us. Maybe they were just telling stories they'd heard, passing on traditions without worrying too much about literal versus metaphorical, and our modern obsession with categorization and proof would seem strange to them, like missing the forest for the trees. But then again, maybe they did worry about truth and accuracy. Maybe they were trying to preserve genuine history against the erosion of time, and we're the ones failing to take them seriously, dismissing as myth what they recorded as memory. And this is the fundamental question you have to answer for yourself as you drift off to sleep tonight. Do you trust ancient people to know what they saw, experienced, to distinguish reality from imagination, to accurately record their past? Or do you assume that anything strange in their accounts must be error or fabrication or misunderstanding? And your answer reveals your priors about human nature, and the reliability of testimony, and the possibility of experiences outside our current paradigm, and neither answer is necessarily wrong. Ancient people were both capable of accurate observation and prone to mythologizing, both reliable in some contexts and unreliable in others, just like modern people, just like you and me. We're not fundamentally different from the Sumerians despite the technological gap. We're the same confused creatures trying to make sense of our existence and our origins, and our place in a cosmos that's far larger and stranger than we can fully comprehend. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Anunnaki texts. Not any specific factual claim about ancient astronauts or genetic engineering or global floods, but the reminder that humans have always asked the same questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? Are we special? Are we guided or abandoned? And the Sumerian answer was that beings from heaven came and organized things, and created us for a purpose, and then stepped back to let us continue on our own, which is at least a satisfying narrative arc, even if we can't verify its literal truth. And as you lie here in the dark, letting these ancient words wash over you, these stories of gods and humans and the complicated relationship between them, maybe the historical accuracy matters less than the psychological truth, that we are creatures who need origin stories, who need to believe our existence has meaning and purpose, who need to feel connected to something larger, even if we can't prove that connection exists. And the Anunnaki gave the Sumerians that connection, that sense of cosmic significance, and through Sumerian texts they've given it to us too. The strange tales of beings from the stars who came to Earth and changed everything, who might have been gods or aliens or neither or both, who exist now primarily as words on clay tablets, in climate-controlled museum cases, fragile remnants of civilizations long gone but still speaking. If we're willing to listen, still posing questions we can't fully answer, still suggesting that human history might be stranger and more complex than we've been taught. And whether you drift off tonight believing in ancient astronauts or ancient mythology or some unnamed third option, at least you've engaged with humanity's first written words. You've touched the beginning of recorded history. You've stood in imagination beside those massive ziggurats and wondered along with the ancients what the heavens might contain. And that's worth something regardless of conclusions. The act of wondering itself is valuable, the willingness to entertain possibilities without demanding immediate certainty. So as the Sumerians fade back into history, and the Anunnaki return to whatever realm they originally came from, or never left, or never existed in, you can rest, knowing that the mystery remains unsolved, that ancient clay tablets still wait in museum archives containing texts we haven't fully translated, that new discoveries might yet change our understanding, that the past is not closed but open, not dead but alive with possibilities, and with that comforting uncertainty, you can let yourself drift deeper into sleep, the same sleep humans have sought since the first nights in Sumerian cities, when people lay on roofs under the stars, and wondered if beings from those stars were watching, and whether they were or weren't. The wonder remains, the questions persist, the clay tablets endure, and that's as close to immortality as anyone gets, words surviving, stories persisting, mysteries remaining mysterious. And so good night from ancient Sumer, from the land between the rivers where writing began and civilization emerged, and gods walked among humans, or humans imagined gods walking among them, which might be the same thing. And if you enjoyed this journey through the oldest history humans wrote, through the tales of the Anunnaki and their legacy carved in clay, take a moment when you wake to subscribe for more explorations of the strange and ancient, more bedtime journeys, through the weird corners of history, where fact and mythology blur, and nothing is quite as simple as we've been taught. But for now, just rest, just let the ancient words fade, let the ziggurats crumble back to dust in your mind, let the Anunnaki return to the stars, or the imagination, or wherever they reside, and sleep the same sleep humans have slept for 4,000 years since these stories were first told, deep and dreamless and peaceful, while clay tablets in museums continue their silent vigil, preserving mysteries we may never fully solve but can always continue to ponder. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for drifting through history with me tonight. End of script. Sweet dreams.